everybody to this afternoon's panel entitled How Has International Development Changed Since the Founding of the Peace Corps? My name is Jack Sennett. I am an MPID here at the Kennedy School from the UK. For those of you who are not aware of the MPID course, it is an international development focused course at the Kennedy School that aims to train students to be practitioners in the field of development. The MPID mostly contains students from lower and middle income countries who have often grown up with widespread poverty, a visible part of their daily lives, and are committed to returning home and catalyzing economic development there. But for me and others from advanced economies, the call to serve is necessarily different. It involves a sense of duty to those from other nations in less fortunate circumstances. And this is exactly the sense of duty that John F. Kennedy was invoking when he founded the Peace Corps. As some of you know, JFK first proposed the idea of the Peace Corps during a campaign speech on the steps of the University of Michigan Student Union. Speaking to an audience of thousands of students who'd waited late into night to hear him speak,
3 in the morning.
Asked, how many students of medicine are willing to travel to Ghana to care for the sick? How many engineers will commit their lives to flying around the world as part of the Foreign Service? The answer he got was emphatic. Many said they were, and many did. Thousands signed up. Now, as we were about to hear, a lot has changed in development since the Peace Corps' founding in the early 1960s. Thankfully, however, this call to serve those most need in the world appears to remain strong, including in the MPID course. Personally, my service began in Ethiopia, shortly after I graduated college, where I worked with coffee farmers, many of whom were cultivating less than an acre of land, helping them boost productivity in their farms and generating much-needed cash. Another MPID first year, Andrew Aylesbury, was a Peace Corps volunteer in Guinea when Ebola struck and was evacuated midway through his service. Undeterred, he returned with a new organization to help fight the disease a few months later. Others worked in the world of research, understanding what interventions are most effective at fighting poverty, from contexts such as Zambia to Andhra Pradesh. I certainly think that if JFK were alive with us today, he would agree that the desire to serve the developing world remains strong. One person who certainly has felt the call to serve is our moderator, Meighan Stone. Meighan is president of the Malala Fund, working with the much celebrated Nobel Peace Prize winner, helping to empower girls globally. Previously, she served as Vice President for Communications and Special Projects at the World Food Programme and has had high-level projects with Bono's One campaign, the UN, the World Economic Forum, the Clinton Global Initiative, and the G7. She's currently a fellow at the Shorenstein Center here at the Kennedy School, where she focuses on social entrepreneurship and the intersection of media and refugee policy. Please join me in welcoming her to the panel.
Thanks. All right. So I want to warmly welcome everyone to this very sparsely attended panel in the dreaded late afternoon time slot. So let's all agree to have a really energetic discussion and debate together today. I just finished working last 3 years for a very proud Pashtun Pakistani family with Malala and her family, and they always taught me that honor and gratitude and hospitality must come first. So I really just want to start by honoring everyone in this room that is part of this community on behalf of all the fellows. To be part of this place is such a special opportunity for people like me and all the other fellows that are here. I had the most incredible office hours yesterday. I had a parade of diverse, engaged, forthright students coming through my office door to sit and to talk about these dreams and visions they have for the world and for their mission and vision. And you're all the ones that have really built and sustained and created and inspired that and that place. And this is a special place. Working with refugees the last several years, spending time in refugee camps, this is a heaven on earth. This place is a heaven on earth. To be able to be in a place where you can think and study and learn in safety and dream really big about changing the world is a precious gift, and it's taken all of you making that possible. So I really want to give another round of applause and just honor you. So I want to say thank you for everything that you've done. All right, I also want to honor our speakers, Bellamy, Oliva, Lopez, Dani, Rodrik, Shriver, and Bob Zoellick. They're all very impressive people. I'm going to trust us all to read their very long bios in these documents. They've done too much to even begin to summarize, but I'm going to touch on each of their experiences when we have this discussion today. So I want to move to celebration, right? So we're celebrating the legacy of President Kennedy and the Peace Corps. And I think oftentimes when you spend time with younger students, that can feel like history. But as we were looking at it together, I was really challenged to kind of reclaim and reframe the Peace Corps as this really powerful moment of social entrepreneurship and ingenuity, right? It was a new idea. It could have succeeded or failed, you know, splendidly or failed miserably. No one really knew. Today we get to see that it is sustained and grown and expanded and is as important as ever. And it was dependent upon young leadership, which is something that's so vital to this community, is really believing in the voices and the impact of young leaders. So I wanted to bring the spirit and voice of President Kennedy into the room. I went down a YouTube hole. Has anyone ever looked at one YouTube video and 2 hours later you're watching cats playing, you know, you're like, how did I get here? So I tried to find the original video. There's only audio, of course, from the speech at University of Michigan. Of course, 2 weeks later in San Francisco, there's the first mention of this Peace Corps, great branding, Peace Corps of talented young men and women. And then there's an executive order. And so I'm going to play the executive order because I think many of us may have kind of be up to here with other types of executive orders as of late, and we'd like to hear a positive executive order that actually inspires greatness. So I'm going to ask the team to play the quick video of President Kennedy.
I have today signed an executive order providing for the establishment of a Peace Corps on a temporary pilot basis. I'm also sending to Congress a message proposing authorization of a permanent Peace Corps. This corps will be a pool of trained men and women sent overseas by the United States government or through private institutions and organizations to help foreign countries meet their urgent needs for skilled manpower. It is our hope to have between 500 to 1,000 people in the field by the end of this year. We will send Americans abroad who are qualified to do a job. We will send those abroad who are committed to the concept which motivates the Peace Corps. It will not be easy. None of the men and women will be paid a salary. They will live at the same level as the citizens of the country which they're sent to, doing the same work, eating the same food, speaking the same language. We're going to put particular emphasis on those men and women who have skills in teaching, agriculture, and in health. I'm hopeful that it will be a source of satisfaction to Americans and a contribution to world peace.
Yeah, I think we can clap for that. Absolutely. So I want to start with Bobby Shriver to talk about this entrepreneurial spirit and energy which your family has lived out so powerfully. And how would you see today, looking back, the entrepreneurial energy, the innovation that your family has brought, not just domestically, but internationally, international development? And how do you think it's changed today? Like, who are the entrepreneurs of today? What are the ways of working? What does it mean to do this work now?
Well, thank you, Meighan. And I hope I pushed the button so this is on. Can people hear me? No. Or maybe I haven't pushed it correctly. The red light on. It's not on. So someone will come and tell me.
Get an assist from your
Here we have an expert.
sister.
I keep talking and she does the work.
Is mine on?
All right. No pressure in the family here. You know, we never believed in any pressure. I found myself in starting these two organizations that are in your brochures that we were really very motivated by our failures. So when we started in '98 on the debt relief, the Jubilee movement, which began in the UK, had failed in the United States and was not going to get its legislation through the Congress. And Bono, who had done Christmas record, if you can believe it, for the Special Olympics, which, as I hope everybody knows, my mom started. Speaking of branding. And in fact, I would say I put in a plug. I know we're plugging Jack all day long, but I want to plug my parents a little bit, because the Special Olympics, the Job Corps, the Peace Corps, Head Start were projects convened and created by my parents at the weekend meetings that Glenn Ferguson, his father-in-law, and others attended, where the creative people who were trying to do original stuff in the Kennedy administration sat around coffee tables and said, well, what can we call it? How can we do it? Who can work for it? Who are the tough young people? Bill Josephson, the general counsel of the Peace Corps, was 25.
when the Peace Corps was established.
One arm.
And contrary to the earlier comment, it didn't take several years to create the Peace Corps. It took 5 months from its first mention to it being a federal agency with a 25-year-old general counsel. So when you ask yourself, where are the young people? When we got into the failure of Jubilee, one of the things we really wanted to do was make it have the energy of rock and roll, dare I say it, and really of the hip-hop energy of young people. And through Maria, I met the great John Kasich, who was then chairman of the Budget Committee of the House. And had it not been for him, we never would have gotten debt relief in this country. Period, end of story. I called him on the phone, and I explained the whole idea to him, that I was working with Bono, that he had worked with Jubilee in the UK and so forth. And he said, well, you know, I might help you, but it would have been a lot better if you brought me Radiohead. Because they're a lot cooler than you too. That was pretty funny for the Republican chairman of the Budget Committee. Anyway, he had a floor fight to get the money for debt relief, which he did do. And once we were successful in that, and the end of the Clinton administration, it then took us a year and a half to raise money to start our original organization, which was called DATA, Debt, AIDS, Trade, Africa, in return for democracy, accountability, and transparency from Africa. So it was tough. Looking back, Meighan worked with us. It was hard to attract money and interest to these issues. And once we got rolling a little bit, and we had a little bit of a staff, we engaged with everybody, including the great Bill Frist, who was the senator from Tennessee and the Republican majority leader, who after a year or so of working with us in DC and Forum and very smart people like Bob and others in the room, we asked him how we're doing. He said, well, you're doing well in DC, but you haven't made it to the pig roast. And we took that to heart, the pig roast, because what we recognized was that we had to get to people ordinary people where they actually live, the malls. Bob Rubin said to us, it's slightly different. He said, you guys got to be like Nike. Don't run around Washington, or he could have said, don't run around Harvard, because you're good there. Where you're not good is at the pig roast and in the malls. And that's where Red came from. Red came from we wanted to sort of jujitsu, if you will, the energy of these big private companies who are already spending millions and millions of dollars marketing products. Armani watches. I usually have a real show and tell, but these are all available for sale after the meeting.
In the merch area of the panel.
The merch. I got a lot more in my little bag out back. But what we tried to do is jujitsu their marketing budget into budgets about development, and to give Americans at pig roasts and in malls the idea that development could be exciting, as the Peace Corps was exciting, challenging, and that you could participate in various levels. So you could become a Peace Corps volunteer and go learn a language and live on the side of the hill and eat the food, as President Kennedy was saying, or you could do other things. You could have a different role. And so some people who wanted to support development could just shop. Others could work in the One campaign, which is we renamed DATA the One campaign, and do political activism. So we always were looking for rock and roll energy, youth energy, hip hop energy. I have a friend, a well-known hip hop guy, and whenever you call him, you go, how you doing? He goes, what are you doing? He goes, I'm busy getting paid. What are you doing?
Well, I mean, get paid indeed. I want to talk about the real impacts of RED. $465 million for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, and over 90 million lives have been impacted through your work with the Global Fund. So this isn't just about popular culture, it's about measurably harnessing it for real resources and change. And
the other thing that's to us was just as important was the amount of advertising that went on.
Yeah.
So people got the Gap T-shirt inspired ads in there. Annie Leibovitz took the pictures. I mean, these are kinds of things that regular development people couldn't do. Even Bono couldn't hire Annie to photograph 50 people and fly all over the, we didn't have a budget for that. But Gap did. And Gap was quite, like, wow, really? We're going to do that? So great. That was a tremendous combination. Or Converse designing sneakers. They went out and got a bunch of young designers all over the world to design Converse sneakers and then sold them in museums, venues. And they're available on eBay for thousands of dollars. So the way to communicate all of the sophisticated ideas developed in the World Bank and elsewhere to regular people and gain their support was our additional, objective to the red work. And to one, we just, wanted to do the inside the Beltway kind of smart policy work that we hope that we were doing there.
Yeah. Before we go to Carol and her deep experience with the Peace Corps, I wanted to ask about how your modality really puts at the center working together with African leaders and partners, musicians, heads of state, activists, and advocates between the work at One and also at Red, and how you've been able to do that so effectively. And that is something that's been really vital to how the sector has needed to change. And there's been incredible work done by One and Red in that.
Well, I think it's really honestly mostly done by One, and what we have tried to do there is to export, if you will,
You either have a cheering section or a jeering section. We're not sure.
I assure you it's the pressure section. I'll receive memos from each one of these, like, well, that was pretty good, but. Moving right, as my mother used to say, moving right along. We tried to export our activism model, which you worked hard with us on, and particularly to export it to women activists on the continent, where so many issues are related to girls' education and other kinds of freedoms for women activism. And that's been successful in some countries, less successful in other countries. But we're pushing ahead on that. We hope to have our first African Red company this year. We haven't had one till now. So we're in the process of trying to develop that. But the entrepreneurial energy in Africa, I've just come back from North Africa where we had our board meeting, is incredible, particularly among women. I have to say, women are borrowing money, how about this, at 30% annual interest rates, and they still make money. Paying 30% for money. So Gates have done a tremendous job, by the way, on studying how if you reduce the cost of capital to these women entrepreneurs to something reasonable, pick a number, 12%, still a high number, the profitability of these small farms and other ventures, particularly ventures conducted on cell phones, money transfers and other kinds of communication ventures, the profitability of these things is quite high. And they can afford to pay 30% for money. So the capacity in the finance, I mean, we're not doing this, but Gates is working on it and various other people, but I don't know how many financiers there are here, but the capacity of finance to be conducted on these devices is really at its beginning stages. Money transfers, whereas a lot of money transfers now get stolen, paper transfers, when they are transferred to phones, particularly women can control the money then, because it comes into their phone. It doesn't come to a post office box. So there are just amazing amounts of innovation and entrepreneurship going on in the so-called private sector in West Africa and East Africa and Lesotho. Incredible stuff going on.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, the work.
Sorry to talk so long.
No, it's all good. The work
Come
of
on.
Red is so important. And thank you for giving me a chance to giving me a job. I really appreciate that.
You were great.
Hopefully I
We
earned
were
my
sorry
keep.
to lose you
I know.
to Malala.
So I want to move to Carol, who I also have to honor because you've been a longtime leader in international development as a woman. I'm sure no other woman in the room has ever maybe looked around the room and not had a woman to look up to. That's never happened, that you've been in a room with mostly men, I'm sure. Happened to me, and being able to see Carol and her example has been really powerful. So thank you for all that you've done, whether it was being a Peace Corps volunteer and then being the first returned volunteer to be the head of the Peace Corps, head of UNICEF for 10 years. And so you've seen it all, and I know you were speaking with me about the powerful quote that we are going to hear as scripture and verse today about ask not what you can do for your country. And you were saying about how you feel it's more needed than ever today, that these words have a new resonance and importance, and I was wondering if you would share about that from your experience.
Well, I mean, we heard the quote again in the first session. Well, I think it was reflective of an American people where there was a confidence in Americans and their ability to do, not a sense of failure or somebody else to do or an anger. There was a sense of optimism. Or we heard the word again in the first session of promise, outward looking. So I think it was very reflective of that, and I think that's we are very much in need of that today. We live in a borderless world. We live in a world where we're connected. Again, we heard many things, whether we're connected by by the best in healthcare or the worst diseases. We're connected in the best of education or the worst of education. We're connected by economy, by trade, by all of these issues. By the way, I agree about the entrepreneurial spirit of women in developing countries around the world. Amazing what would happen if we let them try and bring peace in some of those countries. But we're not doing that yet. And I'm sorry to go a little bit, but if you really want to know entrepreneurial people, I will tell you they are Peace Corps volunteers.
Yes.
They are some of the most entrepreneurial folks out there these days, if you really want to know. So if this is a country that's interested in good entrepreneurial spirit, keep making sure the Peace Corps gets funded all the time, because they figure out a way to get things done. If you've met, how many RPCVs are there in the room? Return Peace Corps volunteers.
Thank you for your service.
First of all, I'll say this after, but first of all, I think Peace Corps was both right for its time, but ahead of its time, because it is reflective of what we're talking about today, which is not doing for others, but partnering. Mm-hmm. That's what international development is about today. It's recognizing that it's not that we know better. We're partnering, and that's what Peace Corps has been about. But if you know Peace Corps volunteers, the projects they go in and work on at the request of countries, very often, which are great, but very often their strongest project is their secondary project. If anybody's a returned volunteer, they'll know that. And that's because once they're there, they're living with families, they're there and they're engaging in the language, they're anchored in the community, they're not behind some US mission that looks like a jail now or a prison that people can barely get out of, not only not get in. They're on the ground, and that entrepreneurial spirit comes through. So I wanted to make that point. So you build on the optimism, you build on the promise, you give that entrepreneurial spirit. It is the cheapest radicalization program in the entire United States, in my view. And I mean radicalization in a very positive sense.
Well, I wonder if you can say anything about your personal experience from being a Peace Corps volunteer, because you were in training when President Kennedy was tragically lost. And what was that experience? How did you feel in that moment about, you were very much at the front of leaning in and like pushing ahead and taking that vision forward, even at a moment of doubt in the country? Like, what did you feel like when you were getting ready to go to Guatemala and had no training previously, right? You're getting ready to go do this big, bold thing.
Well, early Peace Corps training was great. I mean, I'm convinced, and then I was the director, but I'm convinced if you were all qualified for anything, they sent you to Africa to be a teacher. And if you were totally unqualified, liberal arts graduate, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, totally unqualified, they sent you to Latin America to be a community developer. I was a community developer in Latin America. Early Peace Corps training was in the United States. Peace Corps training for many years now has been in country. I mean, it was good in the United States. My group, Guatemala 3, we trained in, there'd only been 3 people in Guatemala before, so we were the first real group for Guatemala. We trained in at New Mexico State. So one of the things we were going to do was agriculture. Early Peace Corps, a lot of agriculture people. It's one thing that I think we've lost a bit, and we've moved too much into food security and away from basic agriculture. Anyway, so they taught us how to raise chickens. I'm from New York. I had only eaten chickens before. I didn't know what. But even in those days, they had chickens in little boxes. And I got to Guatemala, there were no chickens in boxes. They were running around. So early Peace Corps training was, with all due respect to Bill Josephson, who I love dearly, good friend, was a little iffy.
He was definitely responsible for
Right.
it. Not my father.
But it worked because the volunteers went out there. We learned. We ultimately spoke the language. I mean, we massacred the language sometimes, but Peace Corps always put a huge amount of effort into language. It believes, very importantly, we lived in the communities, we lived with families, and then Peace Corps evolved over the years. But it was, nobody in my group left because of the assassination. If anything, we were more motivated, I think, to go out there and make a difference. Try and make, that's that much of a difference. Nobody ever thought they were making that much of a difference. Just that much of a difference. But every one of us could make that much of a difference.
I think that's so meaningful. I'm sure everyone in the room has faced some sort of challenge and you had a decision to either press on and use it as the fuel for the fire of doing something good or give up. So thank you for your service, and that launched an incredible career. So thank you to the Peace Corps. I want to go to a young leader, an emerging leader, Oliva Lopez, who used to be Associate Policy Director for Michelle Obama, First Lady, and was at the Peace Corps and iterating, right? So again, the idea that this is a concept that's growing and changing, and social entrepreneurship iterating. And so that was Let Girls Learn. And so I was wondering if you would share about it. And I have to give a shout out to Oliva. She literally flew in from India yesterday with no clothes because she was doing field work. So she went to the Gap this morning, which is a red partner, to get an outfit so she would be presentable for this esteemed audience. So she really, really was so gracious to come. But can you talk about your experience with the First Lady and Let Girls Learn?
Absolutely. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Great. So, as you know, almost a little over 2 years ago, Let Girls Learn was launched. It is a girls' education initiative, and it was launched in partnership with Peace Corps. And one of the most exciting things about this partnership between the White House and Peace Corps was the ability to really get at the root causes of why is it that a lot of girls, when they reach adolescence, are not able to complete their education. And in all the conversations that we've had with experts and all the conversations we've also had with girls themselves and all of those who've been doing the work, it's very clear that there isn't one particular reason why why girls are prevented from completing their education. It could be an economic issue, it could be a cultural issue. It depends on where you are. And so the brilliance of being able to work through Peace Corps is that our volunteers are at the community level. They are there for 2 years, they learn the language, they live with local families, and in the course of their primary project, they get a chance to really understand what is going on. And through that understanding, they're able to work with their local counterparts. And it could be other teachers, it could be religious leaders, it could be parents that are interested in being part of the solution. And really that's the brilliance of the model, that it's not someone else coming from outside and telling someone what they need to do, or this is what they should be doing with their daughter's life. It's really someone who's taken the time to gotten to know them and really asking the community, what is it that they can do together? And that is why it's so important, and it makes it sustainable. It's not someone coming from outside and telling them what to do, but it's really someone from outside coming and saying, I want to be helpful. It's partnering with them, and it's helping them find the solutions. And so the communities are really invested in the projects that volunteers then propose and are able to implement, because they co-created with these volunteers. And the volunteers, there's a mechanism at Peace Corps that's called a Peace Corps Partnership Program. It is basically a crowdfunding mechanism that allows anybody in the American public, friends, family of the volunteers, but anyone in this room, when a volunteer in their community develop their project proposal, then it's placed on the Peace Corps website, and anybody can donate to that
It's
project.
like Peace Corps Kickstarter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
awesome.
it really, Let Girls Learn gave an opportunity to really take the work that Peace Corps volunteers have been doing from the beginning. I mean, one of the main tenets of Peace Corps, it's in the Peace Corps Act, is that Peace Corps volunteers are encouraged to promote gender equality. And so it was really taking the great work that volunteers have been doing for more than 50 years and really building on that and giving it a platform to do more, to bring it to scale, to work in new partnerships, and to really learn from what the volunteers in their communities are doing, because that's where the real learning happens. One of the key interventions that our volunteers have been working on, it's something that we call the GLOW camps. It stands for Girls Leading Our World. And these are basically camps for girls. A lot of the times this is the first time that girls are away from home. And they not only get classes on reproductive health and career planning, but it's also what we call life skills. And it's about building their confidence, and it's about building the leadership skills. Because we understand that it's important for them to stay in school and complete their education, and we're committed to getting them through their secondary education. But it's also what they do with that education, and then how they take what they learn and take it back to their communities. And so these girls, they leave these camps and they're changed forever. They get back home and they want to talk to their friends about what they learned. They share what they learned. And what we've noticed is that a lot of these girls want to be that force of leadership moving forward. So our volunteers are able to support them in continuing their work, and a lot of them start their own clubs when they go back home. And this work continues, and what we've seen time and time again is that our volunteers start with one of these camps, and the girls themselves take it over after. The volunteer leaves after their service after 2 years, but there's usually someone there from that community who's continuing this work. And we've seen tremendous impact from graduates of these kinds of programs that have gone on to university to become teachers, and then they partner with the universities. And so the multiplier effect of these kinds of interventions is amazing. It continues long after the volunteers have left their placement. So this is really what we're trying to do with that initiative, is to really scale it, give it the highlight that it deserves, and bring other partners so that we can continue to do more of this work.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask, I know we had breakfast this morning, we were talking about your time at the Peace Corps and your experience. You grew up in Mexico, came to the U.S. when you were 15, and you had the opportunity to work in the First Lady's Office on Policy, which is incredible. And what's your perspective as a Latina woman working at Peace Corps today about how it can continue to change and iterate and grow and really continue to be a force for good and change?
It's really exciting to see more sort of faces that look like my face right at the Peace Corps headquarters building. I think the agency has been doing a lot of really great work under the leadership of Carrie Hessler-Radelet to diversify the pool of applicants for the Peace Corps. So it was really wonderful to work with a lot of other colleagues who were Latinos and who served in Latin America. And it's great because it gives you that connection to sort of your roots and where you came from, and it's opportunity to give back. My motivation for getting into this kind of work is my experience growing up in Mexico, and I was very fortunate to have access to a great education and have families that were my family was very supportive, but other students don't have that benefit, especially other girls. When they reach adolescence, there's pressure to work, to drop out of school. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to give back, and it was really also wonderful to be part of a team that was also looking creatively at how can we encourage more students from sort of diverse backgrounds to apply for the Peace Corps, and really bring that diversity of perspectives and experiences as well to the agency. And I also want to say it's not just young people and students from different sort of backgrounds, but also the agency is making an effort to encourage people who are thinking about second careers or people in retirement to also consider joining the Peace Corps. It's not just for people who just graduated.
We can pass around a clipboard later if anybody wants to consider that.
Yeah.
We're ready. After you buy your red phone, you can sign up for your second career in the Peace Corps. We're a full service operation at this panel.
Almost 10% are over the age of 50.
That's fascinating. That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's so good.
Yeah, and one of the things that I also kind of just wanted to mention and sort of to go back to when we were talking about the experience of working in the office of the First Lady, this is something that really resonated with her, her own background as a community organizer in Chicago. This is something that the model of the Peace Corps really, again, the model of empowering others and helping them see their potential and helping them reach for that potential. It was what was so important about being able to work together.
Thank you for sharing that personal perspective. I have to say, I think there's something tremendously powerful about an initiative that was announced in the 60s with the fight for civil rights that the first African-American First Lady took this and iterated it and made it new and fresh and working on girls' education globally. I think that's phenomenal. I want to move to policy into Bob Zoellick, of course, from President of the World Bank, and is such a force for students here, and it's been challenging to look at applied history. You know, it's like, how do we take the perspective of today, this moment of 100 years after President Kennedy's birth, and really think about how does this Peace Corps legacy fit within the larger agenda at the time in terms of the Cold War, with the USSR, this idea of winning hearts and minds in a really powerful way, in addition to develop and the balance between those two and the strengths in each approach. So what have you seen as you've looked back? And
well, first I have to say, the main reason I'm here, as Bobby announced, was that my wife used to play with him when they were like
Maria.
7 or 8, 9,
Don't
and
leave Maria out.
And I asked, what was it like? And she said, he's really good at organizing games. She said, but I always thought when he came back that guy could be really good in marketing. So I think it was an early judge was that.
Very good.
I'm going to take a slightly different approach to this, and it's a little bit based on what Caroline was talking about earlier. I want to put the Peace Corps in the context of the time here. So remember, this is 1960. This is the heart of the Cold War. But there was something else. Remember, John F. Kennedy was a very young man when elected, and his predecessor, Dwight Eisenhower, had been the commander-in-chief of the forces in Europe. This was the ascension of the junior officers. This was the junior officers of World War II, and they were very much moved by the sense of getting the country moving again. Whether it was a fair assessment of Eisenhower, the contrast was very, very sharp. But in the heart of the Cold War, there were really two things that, in a sense, defined what JFK wanted to do. One was this competition for hearts and minds, which, in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War, 25 years on, sort of slips, but this was a very real thing there. But it was also, as your panel discussed, avoiding the miscalculation that would lead to a nuclear disaster. In 1962, when you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy had just read Barbara Tuchman's book about the Guns of August. And there's a point where allegedly he says to his brother Bobby, I don't want someone to write a book about the Guns of October, the Guns of August being the process by which people stumbled into World War I. So remember the context again. In 1945, there were only 4 countries in Africa that were independent. Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. In 1960, 16 countries alone joined the United Nations. So this was a vast movement towards decolonization. But you'd also just had Castro in Cuba overthrow an authoritarian government of Batista in 1959. And there was a mood about revolution, which was going to be very appealing to people in Latin America. Khrushchev was talking about wars of liberation, and President Kennedy talked about the alternative of peaceful revolution. So when you look at the Peace Corps, I think you have to put it in a broader context. This was also the moonshot. This was the ambition of putting a person on the moon. This is the time of the Fulbright program, which influenced generations of people from both the U.S. and people that came here. This is the Alliance for Progress. There was a reference to this, which was very significant to the effort in Latin America and involved billions of dollars. This was also the era of the Special Forces, the Green Beret, and counterinsurgency. How would you work with local people? In a way, it's a very entrepreneurial venture on the security side. But also, you mentioned civil rights. If you're in a competition for ideas, it will inevitably focus back on your society. So some of these things that were launched, you have to remember, 1960-61 is still a very segregated society. This is what put the pressure back on the United States about whether it could live up to its own ideals. It's very much a can-do environment, and that comes back to some of the comments that you made on development and lead me to the second point. Development was really still a very new field in the world of 1960-61. Graham Allison mentioned Paul Samuelson's text. He actually got the year wrong. The first one was in 1948. But in 1948, in Paul Samuelson's text, and for younger people you may not know, that was a textbook that was used for generations. There are only three sentences about development. Because when the World Bank was founded in 1944, it's the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It was focused on the reconstruction of Europe. Development was kind of an added afterthought. The first loans were to Paris and a number of European countries. So the irony is people started to think about the process of development. They actually looked first to the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union had managed to accumulate capital and savings with a poor population, but with a very cruel program of forced savings. But so the idea in the development field circa 1960 was, how can you fill the savings gap? We have a lot of poor people, but the idea was we need investment. And a very hot book of 1960 was a book written by Walt Rostow, later became Deputy National Security Advisor and Security Advisor later for Lyndon Johnson, called Stages of Growth. Now the subtitle of that book is very interesting. It's called a non-communist manifesto. So that was what economic development was circa 1960. And the idea of Stages of Growth was you had to be able to start to get outside resources to develop your agricultural sector, to start to get your transportation, others. In the area of the World Bank, in 1960, the original funding mechanism was complemented by something called IDA, International Development Association, which exists today. It's a very different model. IDA gives 40-year-long credits. Often the first 10 years you don't pay anything, and there's a very minimal interest rate, sometimes later changed to grants. So you had to use an ongoing funding mechanism, which still has to go sort of every 3 years. But in 1960, there was also another important development. A man named Theodore Schultz, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, started to invent the idea of saying, look, it's not enough to have capital investment. We're going to have to focus on the basics of poverty of a population, human capital. If you can't get people with basic health, basic education, frankly, they're not going to be very effective in terms of trying to build an economy. So this is a time of transition in this thinking. Now, of course, the effort against poverty gets the real jump when Robert McNamara goes to the World Bank in 1968. He brings in a whole series of things, different data analysis, urban, regional. In a way, what you can see here is analogies between war on poverty, the poverty dealing internationally, and of course, war on communism. This is an era of very big dreams and projects. Now, the problem, of course, is in the 70s with energy prices and people learn about the failures, you start to move to different systems, structural adjustment loans and others. And your comments were all quite interesting on this because I think Dani will have a good feel for this as a true expert. What I think people have learned over time is the importance of not just big plans, but governance, institution, and critically local ownership. If the local population doesn't own it, it won't work. So this era is still one where there's a technocratic top-down focus. And that's where I think the Peace Corps is an added additional element, because the Peace Corps is not a top-down. It is not just the technocratic element. It is, you see the analogies to the community development process sort of later in the 60s. And frankly, you know, I've often felt that the Peace Corps legacy, whatever it was in the countries, actually the effect it had on the Americans that took part on it might have been more significant than anything else. I mean, you see Peace Corps volunteers in the Congress and the State Department, all different parts of the government. It's obviously been a very influential part of their growing up, but also the internationalization of America. This is how a lot of people who had never traveled abroad had a chance to see the world. So I'll close with this thought on the development. It's interesting because of the problems of development and the false starts and the mistakes, there's an appropriate humility that's been added to those sort of words of 1960 and 61. But sometimes this can go too far. In the field of development, one of the hot places is the MIT Poverty Lab, which is just down the road. And there's some very good work done there. But their basic concept is, look, we're wary of big schematic, systematic developments, so we'll just do controlled experiments. We'll try to make two populations exactly the same to learn. When I was at the World Bank and I then would go to them and say, okay, now what can I draw from this? They'd say, oh, well, you have to be careful because if you move any variable around, you know, you can't rely on it. My problem, and the honest problem today in different areas, is I was dealing with presidents and prime ministers and finance ministers, and they were looking for ideas on solutions. Now, the good thing about the past 40 or 50 years is that we've learned a lot around the world from different economies. And you've learned about export-led growth and some of the failures of some other different models. And it has to be an ongoing learning process. And increasingly, developing countries can learn from other developing countries. But I think coming back to the role that President Kennedy played, look, obviously, we've all learned a humility from some of these things. But the idea of big visions, of pushing people, of thinking about systemic change, I think is something that has always been part of the American vision and which he very much brought to the fore, and I hope we don't lose.
Well, thank you so much for your comments. They're very Harvard because it was a masterclass in economics, generated at least 3 pages of footnotes, and included MIT trash talking. So I feel like you've checked all the boxes of any panel engagement at Harvard. So before I go to Dani to bring us home, I want to ask you to get your questions ready. And I just want to announce proudly, if you're a young person, you're getting pole position. So if you are young, think of your question. We're going to pick you out of the crowd and other folks as well. But I want you to start thinking about your question that you might ask. So I want to go to Dani because you have so much to share on this from your expertise in teaching and study and research. So do you want to talk a little bit about this never-ending tension between these two different strategies that Bob also touched on in terms of the locally focused direct service project and then more macroeconomic policy level advocacy changes and the interplay between those two then and now?
Thank you. Let me first say that I teach in the program that Jack mentioned, which is the MPAID program.
Is he a good student?
He's a tremendous student.
I'll slip you the money later.
He's also a very kind student. He once came right after lecture to tell me that I'd made a mistake during the lecture, but he actually didn't raise his hand during the lecture to tell me that. That could have been. That's the kind of students we have here. So we do get a lot of students from the Peace Corps and the many other similar programs. That actually one of the things that Peace Corps did actually spawn similar programs elsewhere as well. And I absolutely concur with what Bob said, which is that the contribution to Americans actually has been quite significant. That in terms of the exposure to the world in the developing countries and what they brought with them back. Not to mention the tremendous literature and memoirs that the Peace Corps has spawned. Is actually quite interesting. But I want to come back to this question about sort of what has happened since the Peace Corps. And we have not yet mentioned the biggest thing that has happened since 1961 in the field of international development, and that is China. When we look back at this period to understand the process of international development, what I think we will be struck by is the extent of success in development that just one huge country has managed to achieve. In the last 20-25 years, literally hundreds of billions of millions of people, close to 1 billion people, in fact, have been lifted out of extreme poverty. That's sort of basically the dollar a day poverty line, and most of those people were in China. So China has been the world's truly greatest poverty eradication experience ever. And that's, it's a bit of a, for us economists and people like me who teach development economics, it's quite a humbling experience because on the one hand, development has been successful on the ground because China and many other countries, smaller countries that have followed similar paths have been extremely successvel. But they've really done things, their own way. It's not really what we have been teaching. So sometimes I say that development economics has failed, but development has succeeded. And it sort of maybe sort of points to the paradox that many of the things that we teach actually don't necessarily work. Jack, don't listen to what I'm saying here. But I think one of the things that we have learned is again going back to something Bob said is the need to understand that that these things work only if you are locally grounded, if you're contextual, if you understand what's going on the ground. And I think many of the faults of many development programs, such as the capital fundamentalism of the 1950s, or the exclusive focus on structural adjustment programs and deregulation and privatization in the late 80s and 1990s, was that they sort of were essentially imposing our vision on these societies. That's we have this sort of this textbook idea of what they're supposed to look like, and we go and impose it on them. And I think the experience of China might seem very, very remote from the Peace Corps, but when you think about it, it actually goes back to a point that Carol made about the importance of partnership when you think about development, because the essence of the Chinese experience is that they took Western ideas, they filtered them through their own way of thinking, and developed their own strategies that would work under their own circumstances. So yes, it was turnings towards markets. Yes, it was about incentives. Yes, it was about giving people a stake. It was about turning toward world markets and exports and attracting foreign investment. But boy, the way they did it looks nothing like what we would have told them to do at the time back in the late 1970s or the 1980s. So they institutionally innovated. So I think the trick is really to get that partnership right, whether we're talking about sort of at that broad level of macroeconomic development and growth strategy, or we're talking about at a very micro level in terms of specific irrigation project, education projects, that local knowledge is absolutely critical as much as foreign expertise is. And let me just make one final point about the Peace Corps in particular. I wasn't born in this country, and the United States, looking at it from the outside, is fascinating in many, many different respects. But going back to the history of the Peace Corps and President Kennedy and the thousands of volunteers who actually spent time in this program, it's impossible not to be struck by something very special and very different about America. That it's really not only the only country I can imagine where there would be so many individuals and volunteers willing to go and boy, reading some of those memoirs, I mean, the circumstances of these people that they had to go through, living in remote places, and that not only that they were willing to do that, but also that there was this motivating spirit that Americans believed that you could actually make change happen. That this wasn't just completely, stasis. That things actually could be turned towards the better. It's something very peculiarly American, and I appreciate that. And I will end with the same thing, which is to say that I hope that America retains that.
Yeah, your lips to God's ears. Some clapping in the front row about that. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your comments and everyone's about local leadership and local partnership. I have to say one of the greatest honors of my life working in international development was to actually have a 16-year-old Pakistani boss from Swat Valley who's an observant Muslim. And I used to always say at the floor of the UN, my boss is truly a teenage girl from the global south. I report to her, and it's overdue, I think, in the field. So we want to open up to questions. There are 2 loose mics. We have a couple quick announcements. One, we want to know who you are. Please tell us. The second is, please do not give a speech masquerading as a question. Don't do that here. Not with this panel. We want to hear from you, but please make it a question, and we are going to start calling on folks. Is there a young person to start us off? Youngish person. Do I see anybody? I see one person in the back.
Raise your hand.
Yeah. We're going to put you in youngish. Sorry.
Hello, my name is Hizami Bermada, and I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. Some of us earlier were in a event with Dr. Cornel West, and he was talking to the idea of a caring economy and how to really kind of revolutionize the space of care and compassion, and how do you transform that into action. So my question to you all as somebody, my background is I'm a social innovation activist and social justice activist, really working at how do you create systems change for compassionate empathy and transforming it to action. How do you advise, given all of your backgrounds, that we really think about creating an economy, to use that phrase, around compassion and care, to where it's not just seen as a fringe business, but it's actually institutionalized in our governments and our businesses and our corporations and in our personal lives and communities? Thank you.
That's great. Who wants to take that one? Who wants to start? We're thinking about it. Why don't we take a sip?
I can say, ask you, the simplest question is, do you have a red phone? But because, I mean it rhetorically, of course, if people like yourself and everybody else buy stuff that's marketed that way, you're going to change behavior. If you don't buy it, it won't. It's super simple. 'Cause I had 50 meetings to start Red, 50. So 46 people said no. And what they all said one way or the other was, people don't care. They don't care about AIDS in Africa. They don't care about African people. It's too far away. It's not about America. This is all, 2005. And there's debate about whether people will actually spend money on the basis you suggest. And I view myself as a social justice worker. But when you have to prove it out there, and when people, hell, I'll just get the white one. Do you know what I mean? I'm not, you know what I'm saying. I mean, if you direct your purchasing, it's fair trade in coffee. Someone was talking about coffee, right? Starbucks was our partner. They're not right now, although we're trying to muscle them back in. they have a tremendous fair trade effort in Africa and elsewhere to support coffee farmers. If people don't buy that coffee, you won't have any transformation. So it really is, I hate to say it, a marketing problem to explain to people, hey, this one's better than that one, and here's why. And then the market has to respond to that. Because the market goes, yeah. The CEOs go, you know what, buddy, let me show you the data on the sales of your stuff. There's nothing worse than going to that meeting if you're a social justice activist. Because if you don't have the number, they throw you out. I mean, it's not polite. They're just like, hey, it's not selling, bye. Yeah. And you know, that's Zara, by the way, right, in the clothing business. Man, that thing doesn't sell, boom, it's gone.
Yeah.
And it does sell, boom, we make 1,000 right away. So that short, and Zara is evidence of the shortening of the supply chain. People can really, they got data about stuff selling instantly, and they turn the manufacturing in that way. So if the social justice world could become like Zara and be able to persuade people like, hey, we can deliver. Purchase, even small stuff, it's not about being wealthy. You know, we have coffee. We make a nickel if you buy it with a red card at Starbucks. A nickel. That's turned into $485 million. This little thing earned about $10 million last year. Yeah. So, you know, and this is just us. There's 20 people working at Red, and I don't work there full time anymore. So it's a small venture, in truth. So other young people or not so young people who want to create social justice ventures and get it out into the market and tell the story and try to persuade people to buy their stuff. And that's what the entrepreneurial women I find, we were in Morocco, and these women are making incredible stuff, but you know, their first question is, how can I sell it in America? Yeah. And the Millennium Challenge Corporation is trying to finance knowledge about how to sell stuff. Yeah. So linking those people up is the challenge in your generation, and that's why this device, God bless Steve Jobs, this device is such an important thing. It cannot be overstated how important this thing is to development. It cannot be overstated. I mean, this is as big to me as China.
Yeah, yeah. I think building on that, because I hear the question underneath your question sitting in these classrooms all the time, is about how do we change the very underpinnings of how corporations function even when they're not selling these products and how they go into countries. How do we start from the bottom up? How do we actually build a development apparatus and infrastructure that actually puts the values and needs of those communities front and center, and they don't have to fight for them or argue for them or quantify them or make an economic argument, although we'll use all those tools. There's a rights perspective, and I'm guessing that's what you mean talking about Dr. West, right, is about that. Is there anyone that wants to respond to how maybe the policy making, the advocacy piece, building on all the incredible work that's happening with social ventures like RAD and creative work, how can we change that to continue to push that lever? Because it was way too far the other way. So how do we continue to fight for that and change how policy works?
I'm struggling a little bit because we were also talking about the Peace Corps. Mm-hmm. And it's not for the Peace Corps volunteer to be going into a country telling them their system isn't working. It might be working with communities so that girls get an education. And so that those girls in their own communities, as they grow, they help to change the systems in their countries. Or the woman, or the women farmers, or because they change the system. I mean, it's just. I totally agree with what you said, but from kind of a Peace Corps perspective, it is less, we're here to tell you what your system should be, and more to work with you to help create the capacity within your own communities, within your own environment, within your own systems, so that you can bring about the change. You can choose, if you wish, to bring about the change. It's not for us to tell you what that change should be. So maybe that's a second step, but that's that kind of local approach that from a Peace Corps perspective, they would approach it, I believe.
All right, we got a lot of questions all of a sudden. Let's take them two in a batch so we can keep things moving. I see your hand in the back, and then we'll come here to the front. I saw there was someone up here. Start with you. I think we need a mic for you, or need you to speak up for all of us to hear you. So maybe we can run a mic to you so we can hear every word. Perfect.
Thank you very much. My name is Alvaro Salas. I'm from Costa Rica. I come from a school called CAD Business School. It was founded by President Kennedy at Harvard University in the 60s. I was touched by the Peace Corps and also by this effort from President Kennedy, thanks to women have access to basic education. So my question is for Professor Rodrik. In terms of international development, and now thanks to this rise of authoritarianism and new populist governments, how can we ensure that initiatives like the Peace Corps or the one that I went, like ICAD Business School, will have a return on that investment now that the rhetoric between the development and private sector and the role of government have become more hateful and more difficult, and how we can measure that in terms of data and research.
Great, and let's take a second question. We can batch them up. I saw you first. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Hogan. I'm a mid-career from 2013, and I worked at the Center for International Development for a while with Dani. I just returned from a little over 2 years in Afghanistan, where I worked for a federal oversight agency looking at U.S. funding and how it was spent. So my question is, how do you bridge that gap between government missions, whether it's the U.S. or another country, pumping in certain amounts of money for very specific things, basically saying what is needed, versus the grassroots level? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. Who wants to take the question about pertaining to Afghanistan and about funding?
Let me address the first question, and I think you bring up an extremely important set of issues that by all indications, the future is not going to be like the past. We are going through important convulsions in the world economy and in our political systems. And I think along with that, I think our approach to development will have to change and evolve as well. And I think we talked about partnership before. One of the enduring lessons also in development is about the importance of partnerships between the private sector and the public sector in terms of how to make change happen. So one of these never-ending oscillation between it's all private sector versus it's all sort of government leadership. I think hopefully we're sort of leaving that behind. And some societies, and I would put Costa Rica in there as well, where they've achieved the greatest successes is actually where the private sector is working very actively with the government. After all, the private sector business knows where all the opportunities are and the obstacles are. It's the business that's going to be doing investing, but they operate in a system of rules and regulations that's set up by the government, and they need those rules as much as they need them to be eased and facilitated when it needs to be done. So I think when you look around, it's not whether regime is authoritarian or democratic. It's not even whether its tariffs are low or its tariffs are high. It's really the quality of this interaction between the government and the private sector that really matters. And of course, that's easier to do in regimes that avoid the extremes, highly populist, highly authoritarian regimes. Even if they are interacting with the private sector, they're going to be so in bed with certain segments of the private sector. They end up being cronyistic and so forth. But ultimately, again, to connect this topic with the previous discussion, if you want to improve the lives of ordinary people, it's not going to happen through aid. It's not going to happen through transfers. It's not going to happen through social programs. It's going to happen by ordinary people having decent, well-paying, productive jobs. And I think that's really the crux of the matter. It's how do we get those productive jobs going? And that's really is going to be the critical importance of the private sector, is to generate those productive jobs.
Yeah. You want to jump in on that?
I'll jump in and I'll start with a question about Afghanistan. You may know this, but others in the room may not. One of the most successful programs has been the National Solidarity Program, which in some ways is built on some of the same community organizing ideas that we were talking about here for the Peace Corps and in the U.S. Interestingly enough, it was devised by Karzai when he was foreign minister. I just actually met one of the MPP students here who's sort of doing some research on it, and he validated kind of the perspective that I had on this a few years ago. The way the program works, and this was critical given the sort of the breakdown of society in an area that had suffered war for a long period of time, was that you'd start in a community and you'd get the people together themselves. Sometimes the men would have to be done separate from the women. And they would devise the project, and they were often only modest amounts, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. It may be a micro hydro project was one that I visited. It may be a school. The rate of return on those economically was in the low 20s, so very respectable. But equally important was the social capital dimension. When the Taliban would attack some of these projects, the people would defend them. They were their projects. When I went to the micro hydro project, what was striking was there was, in the area where they were generating the electricity, they had a bunch of cell phones, not red ones, but also some women were then starting to sell various services sort of related to it. So you had sort of the private sector evolution on it. Now, and what people were also looking at was to say, okay, now that we've actually started to create some local governance structure, can we build on this? Because that had been missing in the Afghan system. Can we start to use it for other functions? Now, one of the challenges, and Carol Bellamy would be familiar with this from her experience, is that as you start to do this, you have to be a little careful because you may be challenging the existing power structure. That's one of the issues that happened in community development in the 60s in the United States. All of a sudden, mayors didn't like necessarily people sort of coming up from the grassroots and challenging the political order. But I think, one other observation about this is there's no silver bullet. So there has to be different dimensions of that. But economically, socially, in terms of some of the sort of the externalities of the effects, that's something that has worked quite well for sort of modest sums of money. But if I could connect it to the point on Incaya, I've actually been to Incaya, and there's actually a little lesson there. Incaya actually started in Nicaragua. Of course, moved to Costa Rica, and there's a reason it moved to Costa Rica, which is you couldn't have an effective open school in Nicaragua under the Sandinista regime. So there is a point about this, about political and open societies. But interesting, coming back to Dani's point, I was very impressed with what Incaya had done over the years. And when I was at the World Bank, I was actually trying to see whether we could help develop a bit of a public administration program, because part of the gap in countries is actually the capacity of basic level governance, whether we could use some of those skills. But also to connect it to the bigger picture, since you're from Costa Rica, we negotiated, when I was in the US government, a free trade agreement with the Central American economies. And interestingly, a lot of people that believed in social justice were very much opposed to this agreement. We passed it by 2 votes. It was absolutely critical for the development of Central American countries to allow them to be able to integrate with one another and sell to the United States. And Costa Rica is one of the best stories because the most sensitive issue was the insurance industry and the telecom industry. They were state companies, they had tended to be protected, and we just made a little nudge of kind of an opening. And frankly, it wasn't for the US. Our market interest wasn't there. It was to start to break down the government monopoly. And I was so pleased to see that when IBM decided to create a call center, they could do it in Costa Rica because all of a sudden the telecommunications sector had been upgraded and they had the overall capacity. So part of this is, in a way, it comes back to the larger message here going back to 1961. It starts with open societies. Are you going to try to open up to ideas, movement of people? There's not one formula that works. And if the local people are engaged in it, for sure it won't work. But so I think one of the questions here, and I like Bobby's answer for people, in a sense what Bobby's answer to you about social justice was, you got a market economy, you want to connect in a market economy, these are the types of things that you have to do. And you can do it. It does make a difference. But so I guess, sometimes people come with pie in the sky ideas and dreams. My only suggestion would be, you can move the world, but understand how it works. Be a little practical, be a little realistic on how it can work. And I think one of the other benefits of Peace Corps volunteers is you see that in spades.
I know, Carol, do you have any thoughts on that?
We'll go to questions.
You want to go to questions? All right, last round. I have to go over here. Do you have a question that you want to share with us? And
I would like to, just because we live in such a different society as when this film we just saw came up, and I would be interested in whether the panel thinks that appeal, you're not going to make any money, it's going to be tough, how that would be received today, and the role of the media, because when these kind of pronouncements were made, there were 2 or 3 networks and everybody heard them. Today, I can only imagine my kids listening to that, they just flip right by. They wouldn't even stop. So So the question I have is, you know, and I just was asking Caroline, there are no young people here, and she said it's 420 on 420.
Oh my God, your cool points just went off the chart. I can't believe that just happened at our panel. Like, that's amazing.
We're in a very different world today, because I have 4 children. They want to develop an app, they want to make money, they want to, you know, and they think through business they're going to change the world. Would this appeal land today? Carol? Would anybody hear it?
Good question.
I think it does. I mean, the younger generation. I don't even know what letter we're calling them these days. But I mean, they are. It's interesting. When I've gone to some different campuses, sometimes people talk about the long program, and that means Peace Corps because it's 2 years. Because there are other one-year programs, these GAP programs, whether it's Teach for All or other kinds of things, and there's a lot of them. You mentioned before. It's not just Peace Corps spawn thing. And there actually is a lot of commitment in that area. This younger generation is, I think, absolutely prepared to get involved in kind of nonprofit types of things. What worries me is that they're very suspicious of government, and they're not going into government. And I mean, talking about not making much money, sorry, it's not quite. Yeah. But I mean, that to me is a bigger worry. That's just a personal worry I have about commitment. It doesn't mean you have to commit your whole life. I mean, because we live now, at least in our society, where you can do many different things. So I'm actually not worried about there still being really an interest in young people, and don't mean to limit only to young people, in doing some service, some service for a period of time while they're still young. I think they realize that there is a real benefit that they don't realize when they go into it. They think they're going to do for, and then I think they realize there's a young person who can speak much more to this than I can.
You saw a lot of this.
So, so I don't. I'm sorry. I bet you your kids, they're going to develop their app, but they're still going to do some service.
They don't even know they're being called today because they can't even hear it.
Well, we do live in a noisy world.
Right. So the question is, how do you one, make it attractive? 2, how do they even hear it?
Yeah. I can speak a little bit to that if there's time.
Yeah.
And so, first of all, Peace Corps has been very deliberate about how they market and making sure that they're reaching this demographic. And I'm happy to say that at least while I was still at Peace Corps, our applications were actually increasing. So that was actually a really good sign. We changed the website, we changed the kind of outreach that we do on Instagram and all the other social media channels, the kind of recruitment events and the kind of sort of interesting things that we started doing to really make sure that we're reaching that demographic and restructuring our recruitment program around the country in terms of the different recruitment events we have in universities. So I think we are reaching that demographic. And for example, for us with Let Girls Learn, Peace Corps just had tremendous exposure. Every time the First Lady spoke about Let Girls Learn, she always mentioned the work of Peace Corps volunteers. And I think a lot of people who might have not heard of Peace Corps before and sort of understood what Peace Corps stood for would go to the website, read about it, and sort of get to know that this is something they can do. But also, we're very conscious as well. There are so many benefits of becoming a Peace Corps volunteer. It's not only are you getting, another language, you're also getting the experience of living in another country, learning another culture. That is incredibly attractive to private sector companies in today's world. And we were working with other companies, we're working with IBM, we're working with government, so that return Peace Corps volunteers who were coming back to the U.S., we had something called the Employers of National Service, the partnership that Peace Corps has started with several private sector entities. And basically, it's sort of like giving an extra point in a job application for return Peace Corps volunteers. There's more information about this online, but basically, we're talking, we have an office at Peace Corps that talks to the private sector all the time, and they were basically making sure that potential employers understood that actually you really want a Peace Corps volunteer in your company. They're problem solvers, they're very, very creative, they're resourceful, entrepreneurial. They're social entrepreneurs, and they decided to do this in another country and under very trying circumstances, so you want them on your team.
Yeah.
Something interesting there would be whether the B School collaborates with the development economics folks here. you know, they did a case on red, and they got a huge crowd to come to that. Yeah. But they're very capable of, for example, all the stuff you said. How do you measure it? What you did on Instagram? Has the marketing professor across the river here come and looked at what you did and suggested ways to improve it? My experience is they probably don't. And I think the answer to your question, knowing your kids, is that they have their own language. Yeah. And we persist in not learning it. It's the harsh truth. That's why I referred to the hip hop thing at the beginning, because I had to learn that when I made the Christmas records, because none of these artists would have worked with me if I had walked in from my Yale Law School suit and tie and said, hi, I'm...
How about the hat?
No. The hat.
No?
The hat's
All
from the West. We're representing the West. That's new. That's under debate over here. But, you know, I think I'm losing. But the language, I'm not sure, Caroline, I have your vote or not. But the language thing is a serious matter, you know, for young people. And, you know, people 40 have grown up in a different language than President Kennedy grew up in, or really, honestly, than we grew up in. And if we don't speak it, speaking of learning languages, we're not going to reach those folks. And that's a problem in modern politics. You know, and I have to say it's a thing that, God help us, Trump did very well. He was able to connect to certain people with a language that was horrifying, and yet it connected. So, you know, we should all, I think, we should learn that language. It's a very important point, I think.
Yeah. Well, as ever, the last word goes to Bobby Shriver. And so we're going to bring it to a close. But our time is up together, but I want to issue a challenge to the room to leave inspired to continue to be a joint owner in the vision of the Peace Corps, iterating it, helping it speak to younger audiences and generations, and being part of that. And thank you. Thank you for all that you do to be part of this community.